Was Jesus really talking to the devil? A lesson on Matthew 4. Part 1. Why this probably isn't a literal devil. When most people hear the story of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, they picture him having a conversation with a fallen angel named Satan. But when we slow down and read the Bible closely, we see something else going on. Matthew 4 verse 1 says, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." That should raise some questions. Why would God's Spirit lead Jesus to be tempted? And by a supernatural villain? That's not an idea most Christians today would be comfortable with. James 1 verse 13 clears things up, and it reads, "God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone." But the Bible does show that God allows testing, not to make us fail, but to refine us. Isaiah 48:10 says, "Look, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction." Testing in the biblical sense is a refining fire. It exposes what's inside us, reveals character, and prepares us for purpose. So where does temptation really come from? James 1:14 gives us the answer. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own desires and enticed. That verse alone flips the whole narrative. It's not some external being sneaking up on us. It's the desires already inside us that open the door. The real temptation doesn't come from an outside source. It comes from our own desires. And tests are what expose those hidden temptations and bring them out to the surface. That's why one person might be tempted by something that doesn't bother another person at all. One person might crave power, another wants attention, another wants control. It's not the thing itself that's tempting, it's the desire already living inside us. Temptation is not about what's out there, it's about what's in our heart. Now let's take a look at the most misunderstood temptation out of the temptations in the wilderness, and this is the kingdom's offer. A lie that only works if you forget who owns everything. Matthew 4 verses 8 and 9 say, "The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and said, 'All these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me.'" This doesn't really make sense if the devil was a real being who owned those kingdoms. Because in Daniel 4:17 it says, "The Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whom he pleases." And Jesus later says in Matthew 28:18, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." True power comes from God, not from a rebellious fallen angel. And Jesus would have already known this. So if this was a real offer from someone with no real power, it wouldn't have even been a temptation. This wasn't about a deal with a real being. It was about being tempted to take a shortcut. It's a setup we'll see again in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prays, asking if there's another way, but still chooses God's will. And just like that moment, this scene in the wilderness is personal. So what's actually happening here? If Jesus wasn't talking to a literal being, what could it be? When you read closely, it sounds more like a personal struggle happening in his mind. See, the devil is more of a symbol of temptation here in this story. Jesus wasn't talking to a creature, he was wrestling with thoughts, like the desire to escape suffering. That's why Hebrews 4:15 says, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin." This was a human experience, a relatable struggle. This makes it more beautiful. Luke 4:13 says, "The devil left him until a more opportune time." That's not banishment, that's taking a break. Temptation isn't gone forever. It just waits for a weaker moment when you're tired, hungry, or struggling. That's more proof this wasn't about a fallen angel flying off into the desert. It was about how temptation works in real life. So real quick, let's go over the points that we've made so far in this video. Number 1. Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested. This is something many Christians today would be quick to say isn't from God. But Scripture shows otherwise. When we remove the idea of a literal devil, this moment actually fits a familiar biblical pattern. God tests those he calls. Abraham was tested with Isaac. Israel was tested in the wilderness. And Job was tested through suffering. Testing isn't punishment, it's preparation. Point number 2, temptation doesn't come from any external force. Even if a literal fallen angel named Satan did exist, temptation still wouldn't come from him, because scripture is clear. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own desire and enticed. Temptation starts inside us. The devil Jesus encountered in the wilderness wasn't some outside figure. It was the inward struggle, the same kind we all face. And as Hebrews 5:8 tells us, though he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Point number 3, the author of the kingdoms reveal this wasn't about an external tempter. The kingdoms of the world don't belong to some rebellious spirit. They belong to the Father, who gives them to whom he pleases. And he was pleased to give them to Jesus. So if this offer came from a literal being, it would have been laughable, completely empty. But this wasn't a joke. It was a serious moment, a moment of deep testing, a moment where Jesus could have chosen the easier path, but instead he submitted to the will of the Father, as we see in Philippians, where it reads, though he was in the form of God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being made in human likeness. And why? Because God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So to conclude, this is real temptation. It's a real inner struggle. Even without a literal devil, the battle was real. We all hear voices in our heads. Jesus didn't argue with those voices. He hit them with truth. He took control of his thoughts and made them line up with God's will. Just like in the garden when he prayed, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Even in deep pain, he stayed true to God's purpose. So maybe Matthew 4 isn't about Jesus defeating a fallen angel. Maybe it's about what it looks like when we face the hardest parts of ourselves and stay anchored in what's true, because that's where the real power lies. Thank you for listening. God bless.